Hey everybody, Pavis here. I usually don't make this kind of content. I usually have a long, edited, scripted video, but today Chaz released a new video called Permadeath is Pointless. Now, I've already seen this video, but I wanted to make a video kind of going through the points that are raised, dissecting them, talking about them, rebutting or arguing where I disagree with Chaz, mentioning when I do agree, all that stuff, because this is a topic that I really like talking about. It's probably my go-to topic when it comes to Fire Emblem and Fire Emblem discussion. Absolutely love it. I think Permadeath is one of the most intriguing parts of Fire Emblem from a design standpoint. So yeah, let's give it a watch. I'm probably going to agree with Chaz a decent amount. This isn't meant to be a Amelia is bad in general rebuttal. This is meant to be like more of a discussion with what Chaz is presenting here. And yeah, without further ado, I'll be editing and hopping around to the key points. But yeah, let's have a watch.
Hi, I'm Choopy Choosy, back in the clack. In this video, we'll be studying all the mechanics unique to Fire Emblem that encourages players to not reset when a unit dies, and why those mechanics and the merit of leaving a unit dead no longer exists in modern Fire Emblem.
So I agree with that 110%, 100%. Modern Fire Emblem is definitely moving away from Fire Emblem. Did I just say modern Fire Emblem's moving away from Fire Emblem? What I actually meant was modern Fire Emblem is moving away from permadeath as a core mechanic. A lot of the mechanics now, there is no reason to play with permadeath. There's no situation where permadeath makes sense anymore. And I'm pretty sure in this video, again, I've seen it already, Chaz does go further into this. So before I elaborate any further on this, I'll let Chaz have his say, and then we'll see where we go from there.
A portion of the audience might be thinking that perhaps he set his own self-imposed Ironman rule set, in which under no conditions would he ever reset his game even if a unit died. While this is a novel and fun way to play any Fire Emblem, saying that leaving a unit dead is only relevant when applying this extrinsic rule set discredits the situational merit Permadeath has in a normal playthrough, and ignores all the mechanics intrinsic to the game that supports that merit.
Interesting point about intrinsic and extrinsic here. Resetting in itself is extrinsic. The reset button is kind of just a natural thing that's on the system, but the game is not like, the game doesn't have a built-in reset button. You have to externally apply your own logic outside of the game to reset. There's no option to do it in the game, so resetting in a way is almost just as extrinsic as playing with an Ironman rule set. Playing Ironman, you never go outside the boundaries of the game. You are actually playing in 100% within the boundaries of the game to not reset. I do think it's funny how we get those flipped, but I totally see why. It makes total sense why somebody would think as resetting as intrinsic and Ironman as extrinsic.
If there's no weight to an option and the player always chooses A over B, is it truly optional? This is honestly the core kind of crux of permadeath, and again, Chaz goes into it a bit more in depth. But as I went over in my video, the potency of permadeath, which is very related to this topic, when you're resetting, you're really weighting your progress. And not just your progress, but everything that happened up to the point of death, you are weighing against that character's value. And that inherently gives the lives of the units value the further you get into the level. And I find that interaction or that decision extremely interesting and compelling. I know a lot of people don't, which is why, and I think that's fine if you don't like that interaction. I think that's actually more understandable that you don't like that interaction than you do like it. But personally, that dynamic and that feel, that kind of game texture of the units' lives really mattering, especially in critical moments like the end of a chapter, that just gives Fire Emblem this
this edge to it that makes it so much fun to play. It makes it so thrilling, makes it so enthralling.
Doesn't every video game ever made with a game over screen already encourage players to not die and lose their progress? And if so, then what is the point of even having permadeath over just a normal game over screen?
That is honestly the key question. The developers know people are resetting, so why don't they just force it on you? And I think that is a good question to ask of why they haven't done that. Just why isn't that a game over screen? I think that's a very valid question to bring up, and I think you get your answer through the design that Chaz is about to talk about. Anyways, I swear I'm gonna disagree with Chaz in this video, guys. I swear I'm gonna disagree with him.
My conclusion is that permadeath is not actually relevant because it encourages players to keep their units alive. It's relevant because it encourages players to keep their units dead.
Okay, I'm gonna agree with Chaz again. I'm gonna agree with him again. You won't believe it. I'm gonna agree with Chaz again. So Kaga has a really interesting quote about how the game is not designed, but he has a quote about permanent death where he thinks resetting, not that it's bad, but that letting your units die and not resetting or not doing that kind of stuff actually results in a more interesting and compelling experience. I don't have the exact quote on me, unfortunately. Where is it? It's not a big problem if some of your characters die in Fire Emblem. I want each player to create their own unique story. Don't get caught up in trying to get a perfect ending. Have fun. I think that quote definitely ties back into what Chaz is saying here. That, like, oh my god, I gotta hear exactly what Chaz's thesis is again, because I'm just losing myself right now.
Conclusion is that permadeath is not actually relevant because it encourages players to keep their units alive. It's relevant because it encourages players to keep their units dead.
Yes, okay, there we go. I wouldn't use the word encourages because I don't know if it encourages it, but it definitely facilitates it. I don't think, though, that the developers are kind of guiding you to that conclusion, but they definitely facilitate it, and they definitely, I guess, somewhat encourage it. Or I know Kaga, at least in that quote there, was definitely encouraging letting your units die, but that doesn't mean that resetting is like the wrong way to play. Ultimately, I wouldn't use the word encourage. I would use the word facilitate. It definitely facilitates both playstyles, though.
All of these factors make Tanya's death a serious...
Alright, this is the diagram that is really the crux of this video, so let's make sure we break it down as best we can. Easily replaceable, leave dead. Retain chapter progress if you leave them dead, and retain your growth, essentially. If you leave someone dead, you can get a replacement later. You keep your chapter progress, and you keep whatever growths or whatever happened, you keep those. On the other hand, on the reset, we have, if we reset, we could potentially get this unit we're resetting for, in this case Tanya. We could potentially get Tanya to be an absolute beast. So basically, resetting to continue to invest in the character. Cute uwu, that's the character component. You like the character. You want to keep them alive because you like the character. And then also, you get to keep your held items, or again, that's only Fire Emblem 1 to 10 as Chaz has put here. What I find so interesting about this dynamic is that from a gameplay perspective, leaving them dead often makes the most sense. And I guess this is actually, I might have to correct myself later on what Chaz said and that the game encourages it. I don't know. I'm not done feeling out this thought yet. But cute uwu is literally just a personal reason. There is no gameplay reason to keep that person or that unit alive. Like, well, I mean, there is a gameplay reason, but even then, that reason is just their potential or how good they could be, not necessarily how good they are. Although I think how good they are is something that might be missing from this chart. Although you could argue, depending on the game, depending on how replaceable that unit is, that this shifts and is dynamic. Obviously, you can't capture every single possible scenario in just one diagram. But potential and cute uwu are such inconcrete things. While on the Leave Dead side, they are extremely concrete. You get to keep your growths. You can replace them later. You get to retain your progress. While everything on the Reset side is a little more mental, a little more in the air, a little more uncertain, other than, I guess, keeping the items, which, again, doesn't even necessarily apply to a lot of games after 10. So, in some ways, this is very imbalanced. But for most people, this is completely balanced the other way. It really depends on what type of player you are, how this scale tips. If the character work and the character development is why you're playing, like, you're gonna reset, like, because you're invested in that part of the game. However, if you don't really care about the characters on a given playthrough, if you know down the line you can get a replacement, then there isn't really a reason to reset. And that's where permadeath becomes viable. I guess as Chaz is presenting here. Again, I swear I'm gonna disagree with Chaz. You have to wait on it though. You have to wait for this ramble. Wait for my rambling.
Example of Tanya's death, the sum of events which occurred between my last save and her dying made the option of continuing the game without her, or losing my progress for that chapter, further weighted. I created an escape route for a neutral ally. I stole a lot of useful items. One of my characters reached the requirements to promote. Another got an extremely good level up, one in which he procced a 2% chance of increasing his movement range. Not only did these gains require both skill and luck on my part to achieve, but they also required my time. It would really suck to lose all of that and have to replay the entire scenario with the likely outcome that the results won't be as desirable just because one unit died. You know what?
Yeah, that is one of the points I made in the potency of permadeath, put a lot more eloquently and a lot more put in a lot more prettier words. Yes, that's how you say it. A lot more prettier. I think what Fire Emblem can say sometimes is really interesting, and I'm going to revisit the resetting option. Because if you don't reset and you're being pragmatic from a gameplay perspective, that somewhat puts you in the shoes of, again, I know people who don't like permadeath hate this argument, but puts you in the shoes of almost an actual general or tactician, where you have to be pragmatic about the decisions you're making, even if it includes lives of other people or lives of, in this case, lives of fictional characters. You either have to be pragmatic and kind of cold-hearted, or you have to be loving and caring at the cost of your time and your resources. There's something poetic about that as a game designer, I'm like, oh man, that interaction, that what that says about the player, their play styles. And I'm not saying that, if you don't reset, then you're like a psychopath. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is, and I guess I'm repeating myself again, the way that permadeath gives the lives of the units tangible value in relation to how much the resources or the amount of stuff you put into the game. I think that's a really interesting interaction or relation. And I know I'm restating previous points, but it's worth restating in my mind.
But wouldn't it be great if all video games let you continue your progression even if your character died while still maintaining a sense of urgency and tension? That would be the best of both worlds, a huge quality of life boon to the player, and most of all...
No, Choopy! Are you literally trying to spin permadeath as literally a quality of life mechanic?
Now here's where me and Chaz diverge a bit. I really don't view permadeath as a quality of life feature. I don't view it that way, or a quality of life mechanic. I don't view it that way at all. for me, quality of life features, however contradictory it sounds, like I consider Divine Pulse a quality of life feature, but I don't consider Permadeath a quality of life feature, and it's really a semantic kind of debate or semantic kind of argument. But I really don't see Permadeath as a quality of life mechanic. I definitely see it as a core consideration or a core design mechanic. But quality of life, I don't think it's that. If you think about, like, let's think about a game, let's think about a Fire Emblem game where it has been designed with permadeath, or designed as if Divine Pulse didn't exist, and the whole game's designed like that, and then afterwards Divine Pulse is introduced as a feature on top of that. In my mind, then, like, permadeath is a core functional mechanic. It's how the game works. And I really can't categorize of a feature that's just how the game works as a quality of life feature. That doesn't make sense to me. And I can see how, for example, Divine Pulse, technically by the standard I just put, wouldn't be a quality of life feature in Three Houses, because Three Houses doesn't really work without Divine Pulse, and it's kind of transcending a quality of life feature to becoming a core feature. But if Divine Pulse is treated as kind of a layer to put on top of a permadeath game, then it is a quality of life feature. But that doesn't mean permadeath is a quality of life feature. Permadeath is a core mechanic of just how the game works. It's in Three Houses, and it's not really a quality of life mechanic there. Although I can see the argument of, just because Three Houses isn't a quality of life mechanic, or just because Three Houses is a quality of life mechanic, that just because Divine Pulse isn't a quality of life mechanic in Three Houses doesn't mean it can't be a quality of life mechanic in a future entry. Like, the logic can be applied both ways, and I can see where Chaz is coming from on this one, where quality of life in terms of older Fire Emblem games, or in terms of games without Divine Pulse, for the most part, permadeath kind of does offer options to the player to play how they want and facilitates certain play, but ultimately you can't take out permadeath in those games, and you can't take out permadeath from those games and have them still work. Like, for example, you can take out, this may seem silly, but you can take out all the UI improvements over the course of Fire Emblem's history, and the game still works from a design perspective in terms of how it plays. But if you take out permadeath, the game's literally doesn't work as, like, for its design. It just doesn't work. It doesn't function how it's intended to function. The whole dynamic of the entire game is thrown off, and I can't see a mechanic like that, at least by my own definition of what a quality of life feature is. And I guess I'm making my definition as I go here, in the sense that I think that a quality of life feature is a feature layered on top of an existing game experience to make it more, just to make it, again, the words with quality of life feature are very kind of finicky to work with, but to make the experience more palatable and enjoyable. I think that's the best way to put it. And in a sense, permadeath is that, in that it facilitates not resetting as a playstyle and as a viable option, but it's really that layered on top part of my definition, specifically where permadeath just doesn't work as a quality of life feature. I can't consider it a quality of life feature, because then so many mechanics in games are quality of life features. Because if permadeath is a quality of life feature, then so many other things start to fall under that umbrella until the term quality of life feature becomes meaningless. This is kind of just a step further that Chaz takes in his argument that I don't agree with. I don't think permadeath's a quality of life feature. I think it's a core mechanic that if you remove, the game breaks and doesn't work. And by my own definition, Divine Pulse in its current iteration in Three Houses is also not a quality of life feature because, again, semantics, definitions. It also, if you take it out of the experience, the game really doesn't work as it's supposed to.
Yeah, I think I am. While the conditions for an enemy victory in an actual game over screen in Fire Emblem is to kill your main lord, in reality, the AI is generally programmed to target one unit at a time and focus on those in range that are the weakest defensively. Why? Developers understand that implicitly a reset or game over scenario for most players is losing one unit. Losing a
That's true.
single unit, regardless of how replaceable they are, is enough to encourage the same considerate playstyle that a game over screen would. Except that with permadeath, it provides an option that feels organic to the situation and the stakes of war. It's why they drastically shifted the AI targeting priority after Fire Emblem 1 and never looked back. Beyond being really dumb and exploitable, prioritizing the Lord is prioritizing a forced reset. When any other unit is at risk of dying, it is a potential reset scenario, but the player is still presented with an option.
Yes, I agree with this point 100%. It's on the player to reset most of the time. There are situations, though, where players kind of have to reset, especially if their playthrough is going so bad that they literally don't have another option, or they literally cannot beat the game if they don't reset to get that character back. There are going to be situations like that where permadeath and resetting starts to kind of twist it on itself and become somewhat destructive to the player, in the sense that, yeah, they're given the option, but they literally have to reset or they're going to lose or they can't keep playing. And a lot of new players do find themselves in that position where they have to reset, and they don't even really get to see this as an option. Or they don't see it as an option because they literally, I'm going to say literally a lot, but they literally either do not have the ability or the resources to beat the game unless they reset.
Sound crazy? You removed all these aspects of the game. Imagine for a second what a Fire Emblem game like that would look like. Well, luckily enough for us, we don't have to imagine too hard, because that game already exists. It's called Fire Emblem Three Houses.
Yep. Again, I agree. Fire Emblem Three Houses, you could argue maybe echoes in this case somewhat, actually. But not quite as much as Three Houses. But Three Houses, really, the only not viable, but actually, no, I think that's a good word. The really only viable option is to use the turn wheel. Like, the turn wheel within the game's rules is always the best option. There is no reason not to use it. And as a result, and I mean, Chaz is literally going to say this. Literally going to say this. But as a result, permadeath's kind of redundant in Three Houses. It doesn't really function very well within Three Houses as a system.
The roster of playable units is incredibly small, and at this point of the game, the entire second half, I'm not able to recruit any new units that can fill Lawrence's role, or are even remotely near his level or skill set. Recruitable units during the first half of the game do scale their stats depending on your progression, but their class masteries and abilities will be severely stunted compared to the units you've invested in at the start, and are locked behind committing Byleth into specific ranks. There are teacher units in my inventory, but once again, because of limited deployment, I didn't use them. And because of limited activity points, I didn't teach them, so they're all miles behind the rest of my squad. The gameplay revolves around building your units from the ground up. In order to do so, you need to invest in them, heavily. Every unit is a growth unit, but unlike past Fire Emblems, investing in them will always pay off, as getting a blank level up is impossible. Class bases make up for any potential negative inconsistencies, and every student when invested in is really good, including, and especially, Lauren's. The game force deploys your starting units, and only your starting units, at one of the most difficult chapters in the game, meaning that if you did let them die, or you didn't invest in them, you're kind of boned. Take note of the balance in this decision to reset for...
So, before we get into this new balance that's set up, I'll be the first to admit, when it comes to Three Houses, I am not the most well-versed in all its design intricacies and how that works. But Chaz is not the only person I've heard express this opinion. This is, for at least a few people that I've talked about this topic to, that Three Houses leaving units dead doesn't make sense almost ever. It just, and as Chaz hasn't even mentioned Divine Pulse here. You have to invest so much in these units. You have to invest a lot, and it really doesn't make sense to let that investment go ever. I think that point stands. However, I do think that replacements are maybe slightly more viable than Chaz is saying here, but again, I haven't played Three Houses enough. Those are potential caveats. I haven't played the game enough or in depth enough to really have a more developed opinion on the specific part of the video, but let's continue.
But now I have a huge deficit in my army from all the resources I pooled into this one dead unit, which at this point can only be recuperated by investing more copious amounts of time and resources in another unit's growth. The game simply doesn't support letting your units die, despite the option technically being there. If you still don't believe me, go search for Three Houses Ironman.
Now, I'm actually not sure about this argument, because the argument is specifically about maddening mode. I don't think that invalidates the point. I'm sure somebody could do Three Houses hard mode Iron Man. I think that's 100% possible. Maddening, I think, makes more sense where it's probably not possible. Again, I'm not knowledgeable enough about it. And it is true that if you search up Three Houses Iron Man, you either have to really dig to find somebody who's done Three Houses on maddening Iron Man, or it just hasn't been done.
It speaks volumes how we're almost a year into this game's release, and there's still no completed Iron Man run on record. You'll find exactly one mad lad on YouTube who's attempted to Iron Man multiple times, and has this to say.
So I am in the middle of trying to Iron Man.
That's me. That's not me. That's Fed. This is me. Great picture
Three Houses
choice.
to the end. I'm on like attempt number bazillion. I don't even know anymore. And it is not fun.
This is because the game's structure and leveling system makes it very difficult to recover from a student of your house dying, regardless of where you are in the game.
Yeah, it makes sense, and I'm sure it makes sense on maddening. This argument makes sense to me.
If Three Houses doesn't support permadeath when applying an extrinsic rule set like Iron Man, where you're forced to...
Man, I'm going to bring this point up all the time now. That Iron Man is intrinsic, resetting is extrinsic. Whatever, it doesn't matter.
Could you imagine Three Houses without Divine Pulse? For anyone who isn't a complete sadist, it would be a borderline unplayable experience. Sure, it's possible, just like it's possible to beat a game with only rusted weapons, or it's possible to beat the game with Nintendo Labo VR. Hilda!
Okay, I'm gonna come back to this point. This is how some people view permadeath, not in the context of Three Houses. Like, Chaz right here is making the argument that, like, it's possible to do a Three Houses Iron Man on maddening, but, like, it's possible in, like, the sense that of who would want to do that. Some people, the way that Chaz describes this, that's the way they look at permadeath as a whole. They look at permadeath as, like, yeah, I could not reset, but why wouldn't I? And then they reset. And for some people, that makes total sense. Like, permadeath as a mechanic is so inherently unappealing to them that they just immediately check out and say like, yeah, it's possible for me to beat this game or possible for me to not reset. But why would I? Because of where I'm at.
Divine Pulse isn't the problem. It's needed for Three Houses to work on a fundamental level, but its inclusion undoubtedly exacerbates Permadeath's redundancy, where once the options for a player were between resetting or continuing upon a unit's death, they're now displaced by a new third option, Divine Pulse.
Divine Pulse, this diagram sums up everything I feel about Divine Pulse, honestly. Like, Divine Pulse literally, it invalidates Permadeath. The dynamic of when a unit dies is just not even a dynamic anymore. The right choice is to reset. And I find it interesting how at least when I sometimes say that I wish I could turn Divine Pulse off, people say, just don't use it then. But for me as a player, it never makes sense for me to not use it. While in previous Fire Emblem games, it does make sense for me to not use it, either because intrinsically that's the way the game plays if you don't use any external elements like the reset button. That is the way, not the way the game is meant to be played, but that's the way the game plays by default. Now I have to extrinsically self-impose that, and not only self-impose it, but self-impose it in a game which really does not reward leaving your units dead at all. So why would I? And the answer is I don't. When I play Three Houses, I use Divine Pulse because it makes sense to use. It's the right option to use every single time, and the dynamic of Permadeath is kind of erased or near erased. I still have to take some caution to not run out of Divine Pulses, and I can see why some people would use that as an argument of then like, well, then Permadeath isn't redundant because it's making you use your Divine Pulses or makes you conserve or think about your moves because Divine Pulse is kind of just like your backup option. And I think that is somewhat a fair argument, but I definitely have to disagree. So I see where people are coming from, that Permadeath makes you think about your Divine Pulse usage, and as a result, you still have to play like somewhat smart and safe, or else you're going to run out of Divine Pulses. I can see that. But the fact is that Permadeath's role has just been diminished to just that. It's kind of like an afterthought or a side thought at that point. It's really just a very distant factor that is affecting Divine Pulse, and a distant factor affecting the way I play. Whereas in other Fire Emblem games, it's a very ever-present thing. Like, Permadeath is an ever-present system that's constantly influencing the way you make choices and the way you move, and it's there, it's present, it's tangible. And when you put it in a system with Divine Pulse, it's a very distant influence on how you play, as opposed to the more direct role it takes in previous entries. And again, I mean, Chaz says this later too, but that's not saying Three Houses is a bad game. It's just personally, I prefer games where Permadeath, or I prefer Fire Emblem games, or I prefer Fire Emblem games where Permadeath is more present and more active in the play experience, and it's just not there in Fire Emblem Three Houses in the way I want it to.
Because of the game's structure, not only further diminishes the relevance of Permadeath to the player, but also diminishes the choice to reset. Even level-up gains are saved and recoverable when using this option. In other words, Permadeath is a dead option. No one would choose it. Even if you're out of Divine Pulses, that option is not reasonable, regardless of the scenario. Let me state that by no means is Fire Emblem Three Houses bad because it trivializes the option to leave a unit dead. It's a great game that's not afraid to deviate and innovate on the tried and true formula. Everyone should play it, and it's not like other entries in the series haven't also trivialized Permadeath to a degree.
Okay, that much is true. I will disagree. Wait, what did Chaz say? How did he describe Three Houses?
Game that's not afraid to deviate and innovate on the tried and true formula. Everyone should play it.
No. No, everyone. All right. everyone should play it? No. I highly disagree on that point. Is it a great game? In my opinion, the answer to, I don't want to go into a huge Three Houses tangent, but I think Fire Emblem Three Houses is a good game. I think it's a stretch to call it a great game that everyone should play. I highly disagree on that point. But that's just me being a nitpicky kind of Three Houses hater. And even then, I'm not even a hater. I think the game's good. I just don't think it's that good. Anyways, well, irrelevant. We'll continue.
And it's not like other entries in the series haven't also trivialized permadeath to a degree. Radiant Dawn forces resets in early chapters. The 3DS entries have incredibly inflated growths and caps. Even my favorite game of all time trivializes permadeath for the 99.9% of people who don't play for rank.
I think that's interesting, especially FE4, because when I play FE4, I actually don't care that permadeath isn't there. Like, it's there, but not really. It's there, but it's not. It's there as a mechanic, but functionally, it's kind of not there. But I don't mind, and it's really hard to pinpoint why, because it's not like I'm like a Fire Emblem like genealogy purist. I think genealogy is. I really like it. It's in my top few Fire Emblem games, but I think the reason I guess I don't mind it in Fire Emblem 4 being somewhat gone is that if permadeath was actually prevalent in Fire Emblem 4, that game would be near unplayable. Permadeath to an extent is sacrificed to bring up the other elements around it or make the other elements around it more palatable and playable. The giant maps are the kind of the most obvious example of that, where those giant maps aren't really possible or viable if permadeath is a present option, so it being kind of trivialized for that to exist, I guess makes sense. I guess with Three Houses, to go back to that point, I guess I did say that I prefer Fire Emblem games without permadeath, yet Fire Emblem games with permadeath, and then I literally the next sentence say that I like Genealogy of the Holy War, so I apologize for the contradiction. But what Three Houses kind of trivializes permadeath for are just the elements I don't really care for. In terms of the student investment system and monastery, I don't really care for those elements. So when permadeath, an element I do somewhat care about, is trivialized for the sake of those elements that I don't really care about, that's why I guess I'm so not hot on Three Houses. But when it comes to genealogy, I think the things that permadeath is trivialized for, I really dig. Like, I love the giant maps of genealogy. The feeling of like sweeping across an entire country in that game feels so good or so interesting. And permadeath being, I guess, trivialized for that or permadeath dying so large maps can exist. I guess that's the way I'll put it. Permadeath dying so large maps can exist. I think I'm okay with that because I like the large maps. But I can see why some people wouldn't like that, who hate the large maps, and permadeath's gone, this game has big maps, I don't like it. Anyways, I don't want to go into a ramble about FE4, but I do think that is interesting that, yes, Fire Emblem has somewhat trivialized permadeath in the past, or it hasn't always been the forefront, and it has worked out before, so that's not an intrinsic reason to hate Three Houses. And I get that. But at the same time, I don't like Three Houses because of what permadeath is trivialized for. Anyways, we're nearing the end of this bad boy. Let's keep going.
I've said in previous videos, as long as the mechanics work within their respective games, that's all that matters. However, each of these examples at least provides some situational merit that still justifies permadeath's existence in the game. Three Houses doesn't. While Divine Pulse works well enough in a game that clearly doesn't want you to lose your units, I think that including permadeath in Three Houses when the option is ultimately pointless sends a mixed message to fans that permadeath has always been pointless, that its inclusion is a mere formality, a product of archaic 8-bit game design, along with Fire Emblem's brand association of being hardcore.
I agree with that. I agree with that point to an extent. I agree with the sentiment that permadeath is definitely not just some random dated archaic mechanic that should be included just as a legacy option. I agree with that 100%. However, I don't think permadeath not being that permadeath being trivialized in 3 houses necessarily takes away from permadeath as a system as it has always been. I think that's somewhat of a reach, but I can see where Chaz is coming from. I just think it's a bit of a reach. Actually, I'll listen to it one more time just to make sure I'm not putting words in his mouth.
Mere formality, a product of archaic 8-bit game design, along with Fire Emblem's brand association of being hardcore.
Actually, this is a really interesting interaction that I've kind of noticed lately. So, back when casual mode was introduced, elitists, again, this is very generalized, but elitists generally gave casual players a really hard time for how they played. Now, this is mainly online and says, if you play casual mode, you're not playing a real Fire Emblem, that kind of stuff. But the public opinion, or not public opinion, but the fandom opinion in regard to permadeath is much more mixed now, and advocating not for the removal of the turn wheel, but advocating for the reintroduction or reprevalence of permadeath is almost it's not attacked even close to the same way. It's kind of a false equivalency or a false kind of comparison I'm making, but it is true now that casual mode and Divine Pulse and those kinds of game modes have definitely somewhat crafted a public perception that permadeath is old, archaic, and useless. So I can see where Chaz is coming from here.
And in fact, much like many of Fire Emblem's core mechanics, it's permadeath's ability to naturally inspire the player to explore and examine their options in unlikely strategic scenarios that makes it so effective and elegant in its simplicity.
Permadeath being elegant, I don't know about that, especially within Fire Emblem systems. I wouldn't describe permadeath as being elegant. Permadeath has a lot of shortcomings, even in games where it works, especially in regard to how it synchronizes with the story. And by synchronizes, I mean doesn't synchronize at all with the story whatsoever. And how retreating as a core thing is just so immersion breaking.
Ability to naturally inspire the player to explore and examine their options in unlikely strategic scenarios.
I also don't really agree with that, at least, I agree with it in the sense if you're a more advanced player or an experienced player, that permadeath does kind of open up those options to you. But when you're a new player, permadeath feels like the exact opposite of that. Permadeath, when you're a new player or you're first getting used to the series, doesn't feel like a way to explore. It feels like a way the game is hitting you over the head with a baseball bat. Permadeath, at least in a gameplay context when you're playing, often feels the exact opposite of that of, I want to explore and try this crazy thing, but I'm gonna die. I somewhat think that Divine Pulse almost has the opposite effect of that, which, again, depending on what playstyle you prefer or feeling that day, sometimes Divine Pulse, I tried the craziest stuff I never would have if it wasn't for Divine Pulse, and I pull off crazy stuff because I took a risk I never would have if permadeath wasn't there. But because permadeath is there, it often does put a cap or damper on player creativity, especially if you're a newer player, or just even if you've been playing a long time and just aren't good, like me. Honestly, I'm not a great Fire Emblem player, and sometimes I like to play it really safe because I don't feel good exploring all my options when permadeath is going to kind of knock me back to the starting line. So, elegant, not the word I'd choose. Opening up options for the player to explore, also not a thing I would choose, or not a trait I would attribute to permadeath.
That makes it so effective and elegant in its simplicity. Going forward, I hope that Intelligent Systems remembers why permadeath worked in the first place, and maybe use that knowledge to find an intrinsic balance between Divine Pulse, permadeath, and resetting. It's more than possible.
I really hope they do this too. Like, I really hope they do. I think if they can find a nice kind of way to balance all these systems together, that's what I would love. Because I don't hate Divine Pulse inherently because of what it is. I don't even really hate Divine Pulse at all. But I really don't like the current balance or setup, especially in Three Houses, in terms of how the options are balanced. I think if they can find harmony between these three systems, I agree, that would be awesome. But the challenge is actually doing it. This is not like a one change or a one like switch solution. There are so many moving parts, especially in a game like Fire Emblem. There's so many moving parts that you have to make sure work. Designing games is really hard. Designing systems is really hard. And getting these three systems to work together, that's a feat in itself. I hope they try. I hope they at least like kind of work toward making these three mechanics work together, or these three systems work together better. But I'm not going to get my hopes up. Not because I don't think intelligent systems aren't talented, but just that I think that this problem is so difficult that if any team can pull it off, that would be amazing. But like any team doing this or balancing these three systems, I challenge them to do it. It's really hard. Anyways.
Possible to have each of them be a viable option depending on the scenario, and coexisting within the same playthrough. For viewers who might still feel otherwise, I hope that this video at least encouraged you to consider the situational merit of permadeath when it's properly supported by the game's mechanics. If you've been weary to play Fire Emblem without casual mode or Divine Pulse, or if you have played them and you got discouraged by feeling like you needed to reset every time a unit died, give it another go after watching this video. The impulse to reset is so strong, I know, but I think overall you'll have a much less frustrating time if you exercise the choice that permadeath gives you. You may find an appreciation for an aspect of Fire Emblem that was way ahead of its time, yet still has so much untapped potential. And who knows?
I love how this is how he ends the video. But I agree with this part wholeheartedly. The pressure to reset is real. Sometimes you just don't have to, and you'll be fine. You don't have to replay an entire section. You can just not reset, and you'll live. You'll be fine. Again, it's somewhat of a luxury in the sense that if you're really struggling with the game, the way that permadeath beats you back can feel really frustrating and just hard to deal with. So I don't think this advice applies to everybody, but I think the general sentiment is true that like resetting, you don't have to do it. You don't have to play that way. You don't have to Ironman. You can reset when you want to. You can let characters die when you want to. It's your game. You can do whatever the heck you want with it.
You may find an appreciation for an aspect of Fire Emblem that was way ahead of its time, yet still...
I wouldn't know if I describe permadeath as ahead of its time. I think permadeath is a mechanic. If we go to what year did Fire Emblem come out? 1990. Maybe Fire Emblem was the first to do it really on a mass scale, and that I can see it for. But I don't necessarily see permadeath as ahead of its time. I more see it as almost a result of its time, and that time is kind of seeing a renaissance lately in terms of roguelike games and more games that explore permanent death or explore death and permanent death as, you know, as a system. But I don't know about ahead of its time. But that's a nitpick. That's not really too important.
Still has so much untapped potential, and who knows, you might even discover a new best girl.
Oh my god, don't you just love happy endings?
Speaking of happy endings, these patrons, they're amazing.
All right. So that's the video. Overall, I agree with almost every single one of Chaz's core conclusions that he comes to in the video. The core guts of the video, the core guts and the core arguments of the video, I definitely agree with. It's really just a few kind of side points or a few side or sub points where I think Chaz reaches a bit far. But ultimately, the core thesis and the core idea of the video, I agree with 100%. This is a topic that I'm really passionate about. I talk about a lot. I think about it a lot, and I definitely carry it with me into design work. That's not to say I'm an expert on this. I honestly, this is a topic I definitely want to explore more in the future and go more in depth in the future. But I think Chaz does a great job here summarizing permadeath, how it does function, why it doesn't really function in three houses. It's just a few conclusions, a few reaches that I don't really agree with. But ultimately, that's just kind of sub or semantic stuff. It's not really that important. And overall, I'm so glad he made this video at all, because this is one of the most, I think permadeath is one of the mis-talked about, most mis-talked about subjects in regard to Fire Emblem. There's so much going under the hood, so much going on when interacting with the core systems with permadeath, that you really can't generalize it as just permadeath bad, permadeath good, or casual mode bad, classic mode good. Like, that generalization doesn't work, and yet it's the internet, so everybody does generalize, especially on twitter.com. Not to specifically shout out Twitter there, but by the way, you can follow me at PavisFE. If you liked these types of videos, I'd recommend you go subscribe to my second channel, Pavis Plus, which is in the comments section and the description. I make a bunch of kind of unscripted, more candid content, let's just say that, on that channel. So if you like this type of video, you'll definitely like those types of videos. I'm not sure if I'll do videos like these in the future, but if you like them, be sure to hit me up afterward and, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, maybe that bell if you're feeling really saucy. Anyways, thanks for watching. I'll see you guys in the next one.